On the morning of September 12, 1986, 7 men were systematically hunted and eliminated across the rural backwoods of Riverbend County, Tennessee, over a span of 18 hours. All shot at close range, all connected to a single theft that had occurred 3 weeks earlier. The perpetrators weren't rival gangs or drug dealers. They were 4 members of the Hayes family, a grandfather and his 3 grandsons, moving through the Tennessee hills like shadows, methodically erasing everyone who had wronged them over what most people would consider a trivial matter. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation would later call it the most calculated act of rural vengeance in state history. But the reason behind the bloodshed wasn't money, wasn't territory, wasn't even personal insult. It was a stolen hunting dog named Blue, worth maybe $300 on a good day, but priceless to the man who'd raised him from a pup. If you have the courage to hear this story, leave your like and subscribe to the channel. But I warn you, this narrative contains extreme violence based on real events that forever changed a small Tennessee community. Riverbend County in September of 1986 was a place where time moved differently than the rest of America. Population 4,200 scattered across 180 square miles of rolling hills, dense forests, and farmland that had been in the same families for generations. The nearest real city, Nashville, sat 90 miles west on highways that twisted through mountains and hollers where cell phone towers didn't exist and wouldn't for another decade. Most folks in Riverbend had never traveled farther than Cookeville, 40 miles north, and saw no reason to start. September in Middle Tennessee meant temperatures dropping to 55 degrees at night, rising to maybe 75 by afternoon. The air carried the smell of wood smoke from early fires, the sweetness of late summer corn being harvested, and that particular earthy scent that comes when the first leaves start turning. Mornings brought fog that rolled through the valleys like ghostly fingers, so thick you couldn't see the road ahead until it burned off around 10 o'clock. The sound of the place was wind moving through oak and maple trees, the distant lowing of cattle, and every so often the rumble of a pickup truck grinding up some impossible grade. But 1986 was a hard year in rural Tennessee. The farm crisis that had devastated the Midwest was hitting the South with brutal efficiency. Small family operations that had survived the Depression were going under as land values collapsed and interest rates soared. In Riverbend County, 3 farms had been foreclosed that summer alone. For men who'd grown up believing that hard work and honest living guaranteed survival, watching the bank take everything felt like a betrayal of the American promise itself. In places like Riverbend, hunting wasn't just recreation. It was culture, identity, and for many families, the difference between having meat on the table and going without. A good hunting dog wasn't a pet. It was a tool, a partner, and often the most valuable possession a rural man owned. These dogs were bred for specific traits, trained from puppyhood, and passed down through generations like family heirlooms. They represented years of investment, bloodlines carefully maintained, and skills honed through countless hours in the woods. Samuel Clay Hayes was 71 years old that September, though the mountains had aged him beyond his years. He stood 6 feet even, lean and weathered like old hickory, with hands gnarled from decades of manual labor and eyes the color of winter sky. His face was deeply lined from squinting into sun and weather, and he walked with the careful gait of a man whose knees had carried him through too many miles of rough country. When he shook your hand, you felt the strength there, but also the trembling that comes when age starts winning the war against will. Every morning, Samuel woke at 4:30 in the house his grandfather had built in 1903, made coffee in a percolator that had belonged to his wife, and sat on the front porch smoking hand-rolled cigarettes while the world came awake around him. He didn't talk much in those early hours, just sat and watched and listened to the sounds that told him everything he needed to know about the day ahead. By 5:30, he'd be checking on his small herd of cattle, walking fence lines, and planning whatever work needed doing. He'd married Ruby Mae Thornton in 1938, right before he shipped out to the Pacific. They'd had 1 son, James, who died at Khe Sanh in 1968, leaving behind 3 boys who became Samuel's whole world. Those grandsons, Marcus, Daniel, and Luke, now 28, 26, and 24 respectively, lived within 5 miles of Samuel's place, working various jobs but always coming around to help with whatever needed doing. The farm wasn't profitable anymore, hadn't been for years, but it was home, and Samuel Hayes wasn't the kind of man who walked away from home. What Samuel valued most wasn't the land, though he'd fought to keep it through the worst of times. What he valued was tradition, the idea that a man's word meant something, that respect was earned through character and maintained through action, that some things in life were worth defending regardless of the cost. Among those things was Blue, a blue-tick coonhound who'd been Samuel's constant companion for 8 years. Blue wasn't just a dog. He was the culmination of 40 years of careful breeding, descended from a line of champions that Samuel's father had started in the 1940s. Blue could track a raccoon for 3 miles through the worst terrain, never losing the scent, never giving up until he'd treed his quarry. He'd won competitions across 3 counties, had sired dozens of pups that sold for good money, and represented everything Samuel knew about hunting, about dogs, about the patient work of building something excellent over time. More than that, Blue was Samuel's last connection to his son. James had helped train Blue's grandfather, had been there when Blue was born, had named the bloodline that would produce the finest hunting dogs in Middle Tennessee. When James came home from Vietnam in a flag-draped coffin, Samuel had thrown himself into breeding and training dogs as a way to honor his son's memory. Blue was the best of that line, the dog James would have been proudest of, the living embodiment of everything the Hayes family had built and maintained for generations. On August 20th, 1986, Blue was stolen from Samuel Hayes's front yard while the old man was in Cookeville getting supplies. When Samuel returned that evening and called for Blue, the silence that answered told him everything he needed to know. Blue never wandered far, never failed to come when called, never left the property without Samuel. Someone had taken him, and Samuel Hayes knew exactly who. The Garrett family had been feuding with various neighbors for years over property lines, hunting rights, and the general principle that they seemed to believe the world owed them whatever they wanted. Bobby Garrett, 34 years old, had been heard bragging at Morrison's feed store just a week before about needing a good coonhound for the upcoming season. His brother Tommy had been seen driving slowly past Samuel's place on several occasions, looking at Blue in the yard with the calculating gaze of a man pricing livestock he didn't own. For 3 weeks, Samuel drove the back roads of Riverbend County, asking questions, following leads, getting doors slammed in his face when he mentioned the Garrett name. He offered a reward, posted signs, called the sheriff's department twice. Sheriff Bill Morrison was sympathetic but honest. Proving dog theft in rural Tennessee was nearly impossible unless you caught someone red-handed, and the Garrett family had been careful. They claimed they'd bought Blue from someone in the next county, had papers to prove it, and suggested that maybe Samuel's memory wasn't as good as it used to be. On September 10th, Samuel Hayes saw Blue in the back of Tommy Garrett's pickup truck at the Piggly Wiggly parking lot. The dog was thinner than before, had a different collar, but Samuel would have recognized Blue from a mile away. When he approached the truck, Blue went wild with recognition, barking and straining against his chain, trying to reach the man who'd raised him. Tommy Garrett came out of the store, saw Samuel, and walked over with the lazy confidence of a man who thought he held all the cards. They talked for maybe 5 minutes in that parking lot. Samuel asked for his dog back. Tommy said Samuel was confused. This was his dog, bought and paid for. Samuel said he could prove Blue was his, pointed out the small scar on the dog's left ear from a childhood accident, the particular way Blue responded to commands only Samuel used. Tommy just smiled and said maybe all blue ticks looked alike to old folks. Maybe Samuel should get his eyes checked. Samuel Hayes stood in that parking lot watching Tommy Garrett drive away with Blue and felt something cold and final settle in his chest. Not anger, something deeper than anger. A recognition that the world had changed around him, that the codes he'd lived by no longer applied, that decent people could no longer expect decent treatment from those who had abandoned all sense of right and wrong. That night, Samuel called his 3 grandsons to the kitchen table where he'd shared thousands of meals with Ruby May, where he'd taught them to clean rifles and tie fishing knots and understand the difference between what was legal and what was right. Marcus, the oldest, worked construction and had his father's steady temperament. Daniel ran heavy equipment for the county and had inherited the Hayes stubborn streak. Luke was the youngest, worked part-time at the lumber yard, and had always been the most protective of his grandfather. Samuel told them about the parking lot, about Tommy Garrett's smirk, about watching Blue being driven away by men who'd stolen him and had no intention of giving him back. Then he told them what he decided to do about it, and why talking and law and civilized approaches had failed, and how sometimes a man had to choose between being decent and being respected. The three grandsons listened in silence as their grandfather explained that this wasn't really about a dog anymore. It was about whether the Hayes family would allow themselves to be robbed and mocked and dismissed, whether they'd let thieves profit from their theft, whether they'd teach their own children that crime paid as long as you were bold enough and the victim was old enough. Marcus spoke first, his voice quiet but steady. "What exactly are you asking us to do, Grandpa?" Samuel looked at his oldest grandson, saw James's eyes looking back at him, saw the same moral certainty that had gotten his son killed in a jungle halfway around the world. "I'm asking you to help me get Blue back, and I'm asking you to help me make sure the Garrett family understands that stealing from the Hayes family comes with consequences they won't forget." Daniel leaned forward, his calloused hands flat on the worn wooden table. "You talking about taking the law into our own hands?" Samuel's weathered face remained expressionless. "I'm talking about justice when the law won't provide it. I'm talking about protecting what's ours when the system says it belongs to whoever's bold enough to take it." Luke, the youngest, had been quiet through the conversation, but now he spoke with a conviction that surprised everyone. "They didn't just steal Blue, Grandpa. They stole our respect, made us look weak in front of the whole county. Every time someone sees Tommy Garrett with that dog, they're going to remember that the Hayes family got robbed and did nothing about it." Samuel nodded slowly. His grandsons understood. In rural Tennessee, reputation was everything. Your word, your strength, your willingness to stand up for what was right, these things mattered more than money or property or even law. If the Hayes family let this theft stand, if they allowed themselves to be victimized without response, they'd be marked as easy targets for every lowlife in 3 counties. But Samuel also understood what he was asking. The Garrett family wasn't just Bobby and Tommy. There was their cousin Eddie, who'd done time for assault, their uncle Wayne, who ran moonshine and had connections to rougher elements, a nephew named Chet, who'd been in and out of trouble since high school. If the Hayes family moved against the Garretts, they'd be starting something that could spiral beyond control. Over the next 2 days, Samuel did reconnaissance. He'd learned patience in the Pacific, learned to study his enemy before making any moves. The Garrett family operated out of a cluster of properties along Possum Creek Road, about 8 miles from Samuel's place. Bobby lived in a double-wide on the main property with his wife and 2 young children. Tommy had a small cabin a 1/4 mile up the ridge. Eddie rented a farmhouse another mile east. Wayne kept his still hidden somewhere in the woods between the properties, and his nephew Chet stayed in a converted barn on weekends when he wasn't working construction jobs in Nashville. Samuel mapped their routines, their vehicles, their habits. Bobby worked the evening shift at the paper mill, leaving home at 5 and returning around 2 in the morning. Tommy was unemployed, collecting disability for a back injury that didn't seem to limit his activities much. Eddie worked sporadically, mostly odd jobs and whatever Wayne paid him for helping with the moonshine operation. Chet was unpredictable, showing up whenever he needed money or a place to hide from whatever trouble he'd stirred up in the city. The more Samuel watched, the clearer it became that this wasn't just about Blue. The Garretts were running a small criminal enterprise. They stole livestock, equipment, anything they could sell quickly. They intimidated neighbors who complained, used their reputation for violence to keep people from reporting their activities. The sheriff's department knew but couldn't prove anything, and most folks were too scared to testify even if they had evidence. Samuel Hayes had spent 8 years in the Pacific fighting men who believed might made right, who thought they could take whatever they wanted from whoever was too weak to stop them. He'd seen what happened when good people did nothing while bullies consolidated power. He'd watched entire communities destroyed because decent folks hoped someone else would solve their problems for them. On the evening of September 11th, Samuel called his grandsons back to the kitchen table. This time, he laid out detailed maps of the Garrett properties, photographs he'd taken from concealed positions, and a timeline of their movements over the past week. He'd also brought something else, 4 rifles from his gun safe, cleaned and loaded, along with enough ammunition to fight a small war. "Tomorrow's Friday," Samuel said, his voice carrying the calm authority of a man who'd made an irreversible decision. "Bobby works late shift. Tommy usually drives to Sparta on Fridays, spends the evening drinking at that roadhouse. Eddie will be helping Wayne with a run, according to what I overheard at the feed store." Chet's supposed to be coming up from Nashville, but he won't arrive until after midnight. Marcus studied the maps, understanding immediately what his grandfather was planning. You want to hit all of them in one night? Samuel nodded. If we take one, the others will scatter or call for help. If we're going to do this, we do it complete, we do it fast, and we make sure everyone understands the message. Daniel picked up one of the rifles, a Winchester Model 70 that had belonged to his father. Grandpa, once we start this, there's no going back. You understand that? Samuel met his grandson's eyes. Boy, they took that choice away from us when they stole Blue and laughed about it. We can let them make us into victims, or we can remind them that some families don't get pushed around. Luke was examining the timeline, calculating distances and timing. How do we make sure we get Blue back? That's what this is really about, right? Samuel smiled for the first time in weeks. Blue's being kept in a kennel behind Tommy's cabin. I've seen him there during my scouting. We start with Tommy, get Blue to safety, then deal with the rest of them. The four Hayes men spent the next hour going over every detail. Escape routes, contingency plans, what to do if they encountered unexpected resistance. Samuel had learned tactical planning in the Marines, and he applied those lessons now with methodical precision. This wasn't going to be a wild shooting spree driven by emotion. This was going to be a carefully executed operation designed to achieve specific objectives with minimum risk to the Hayes family. As the evening wore on, the weight of what they were planning settled over the kitchen table. These weren't hardened criminals plotting revenge. They were farmers, working men, people who'd never imagined they'd be capable of what they were about to do. But circumstances had pushed them past the point where normal solutions applied, where law and order could protect them, where decent behavior would be rewarded with decent treatment in return. Samuel looked at his three grandsons, boys he'd raised after their father died, young men who'd grown up believing in right and wrong, in protecting family, in standing up to bullies regardless of the cost. He saw their determination, their fear, their love for him and for each other. He saw his son James in their faces, the same willingness to fight for what mattered even when the odds were against them. Last chance to walk away, Samuel said quietly. Once we do this, everything changes. We'll be different people, and there's no undoing that. Marcus shook his head. They made us different people when they stole Blue and dared us to do something about it. Daniel agreed. Besides, Grandpa, you taught us that a man protects his family and his property. That's what we're doing. Luke added, and if we don't do this, who will? The sheriff, the courts. They've already shown they won't help. Samuel Hayes nodded slowly, feeling the weight of 71 years, of loss and struggle, and the accumulated wisdom of a hard life in a hard world. Tomorrow, he and his grandsons would cross a line that separated civilized people from something else entirely. They'd become the kind of men who solved their problems with violence, who took justice into their own hands, who answered theft with death. But sometimes, Samuel reflected, the world forced such choices on decent people. Sometimes the only way to remain decent was to become indecent in defense of what mattered most. The Garrett family had started this war when they stole Blue. Tomorrow the Hayes family would finish it. At 4:47 a.m. on Friday, September 12, 1986, Samuel Hayes stood in his kitchen making coffee in the same percolator Ruby May had used for 40 years. The temperature outside had dropped to 52 degrees, and fog rolled through the valley so thick it swallowed the barn 30 yards from his back door. The smell of brewing coffee mixed with the scent of gun oil from the weapons he'd cleaned one final time the night before. His hands were steady as he poured the coffee, steadier than they'd been in weeks. The trembling that had plagued him since Ruby May's death 2 years earlier seemed to have disappeared overnight, replaced by the cold certainty of a man who'd accepted what he was about to become. He drank his coffee black, standing at the kitchen window, watching the fog lift slowly from Possum Creek Road, where the Garrett family slept, unaware that their world was about to end. Marcus arrived first, driving his battered Ford pickup with the lights off, navigating the dirt driveway by memory. At 28, he was the steadiest of Samuel's grandsons, the one who thought through consequences before acting. He'd spent the night awake, staring at the ceiling of his small house, thinking about his wife sleeping beside him, about the children they hoped to have someday, about whether those children would be proud or ashamed of what their father was about to do. Daniel came next, his county truck loaded with the tools of his trade, heavy machinery operator, a man who understood the power of large equipment and the finality of what happened when that power was applied incorrectly. He'd kissed his girlfriend goodbye that morning, told her he was helping his grandfather with some fence work, hated himself for the lie, but knowing it was necessary. Some burdens couldn't be shared, even with the people you loved most. Luke was last to arrive, parking his motorcycle behind the barn where it couldn't be seen from the road. At 24, he was the most volatile of the three, the one who'd inherited the Hayes temper along with the Hayes sense of justice. He'd spent years listening to his grandfather's stories about the war, about right and wrong, about the price good men sometimes had to pay to keep evil from flourishing. Today, those stories would stop being history and become personal experience. The four men gathered in Samuel's kitchen as the sun began to burn through the fog. No one spoke much. They'd said everything that needed saying the night before. Samuel checked his watch, a Timex that had survived 3 years in the Pacific and 40 years of farm work. 6:15. In 12 hours, 7 men would be dead, and the Hayes family would be either vindicated or damned, depending on your perspective about justice and the lengths a man should go to protect what's his. Samuel handed out the rifles, each man taking the weapon he'd trained with since childhood. Marcus carried the Winchester Model 70 that had belonged to his father, the same rifle James Hayes had used to hunt deer in these mountains before Vietnam claimed him. Daniel took the Remington 700 Samuel had given him for his 16th birthday, its walnut stock worn smooth from years of handling. Luke chose the lever-action Marlin that had been his great-grandfather's, a weapon that had put food on the Hayes table through the Depression and beyond. Samuel kept the Springfield he'd carried in the Pacific, the rifle that had killed Japanese soldiers on islands whose names most Americans couldn't pronounce. The weapon felt familiar in his hands, comfortable in a way that troubled him. He'd hoped never to point it at another human being, but the world had other plans. The Garrett family had made this choice for him when they decided the Hayes family was weak enough to victimize without consequence. They loaded their vehicles and drove separately to avoid attracting attention, taking different routes to converge on the target area. Samuel went first, his old Chevrolet pickup grinding up the mountain roads he'd traveled for 70 years. Marcus followed 20 minutes later, then Daniel, then Luke. By 7:30, all 4 men were in position on ridges overlooking the Garrett properties, watching through binoculars as their targets began their morning routines. Tommy Garrett emerged from his cabin at 8:15, stretching and yawning, completely unaware that 4 rifles were trained on him from concealed positions. He walked to the kennel behind his cabin where Blue was kept, poured food into a metal bowl, and stood for a moment scratching the dog behind the ears. Blue wagged his tail, responding to human kindness, even from the man who'd stolen him, displaying the trusting nature that made good hunting dogs and easy victims. Samuel watched through his rifle scope, seeing Blue for the first time in 3 weeks, noting how the dog had lost weight, how his coat had dulled from poor care and stress. The sight filled him with a cold rage that settled in his chest like winter fog, dense and patient and absolutely implacable. Tommy Garrett was treating Blue adequately, but adequately wasn't enough for a dog that deserved excellence, that had been bred for generations to represent the best of what careful breeding could achieve. At 9 o'clock, Tommy climbed into his pickup truck and drove toward Sparta, following his usual Friday routine. Samuel waited until the truck disappeared around the bend, then keyed the radio he'd brought from his Army days, the one piece of military equipment he'd kept when he came home from the Pacific. "Bird dog, this is Eagle," he said quietly. "Target 1 is mobile. Commence Operation Blue Return." The code names were Luke's idea, borrowed from war movies he'd watched growing up. Samuel had thought them unnecessary, but the boy was right. Using names instead of targets made the whole thing feel more like a military operation and less like murder. Not that Samuel was confused about what they were doing. They were committing murder, multiple murders, systematic elimination of everyone who'd wronged them. But sometimes murder was justice, and sometimes justice required good men to become killers. Marcus moved first, approaching Tommy's cabin from the east, while Daniel covered the approaches from the west. Luke positioned himself on the ridge with a clear view of the entire property, ready to provide covering fire if anyone unexpected appeared. Samuel descended from his position, moving through the woods with the careful step of a man who'd learned to walk silently in jungles where noise meant death. The kennel was secured with a simple padlock that Daniel cut with bolt cutters in less than 30 seconds. Blue recognized Samuel immediately, whining with joy and pressing against the chain-link fence, desperate to reach the man who'd raised him. Samuel opened the kennel door, and Blue bounded out, jumping up to lick his face, trembling with excitement and relief. For a moment, Samuel knelt in the dirt holding his dog, feeling Blue's familiar weight against his chest, smelling the scent that meant home and loyalty, and everything the Hayes family had built over generations. Blue was thinner, stressed, but alive and unharmed. The theft had been about money and meanness, not cruelty for its own sake. Tommy Garrett might be a thief, but he wasn't a sadist. "Come on, boy," Samuel whispered, clipping a leash to Blue's collar. "Let's go home." But going home wasn't possible yet. Not until the men who'd stolen Blue understood the price of their theft. Not until the Hayes family had demonstrated that some actions carried consequences that couldn't be escaped through lawyers or law enforcement or simple denial. Samuel led Blue to his truck, securing him in the cab where he'd be safe from what came next. The dog seemed to understand that something significant was happening, that this wasn't a normal rescue, but something darker and more final. Blue settled on the bench seat, alert and watchful, ready to go wherever Samuel led him. At 10:30, Samuel received word that Bobby Garrett had left for his shift at the paper mill. Eddie Garrett was helping his uncle Wayne move equipment for their moonshine operation, both men working deep in the woods where they felt safe from observation. The Garrett family was scattered, vulnerable, following routines that had served them well when they believed they faced no serious opposition. Samuel keyed his radio again. "Eagle to all units. Primary objective secured. Commence secondary objectives on my signal." The secondary objectives were simple. Eliminate every member of the Garrett family who'd participated in or profited from Blue's theft. 7 men who'd made the mistake of believing that an old farmer and his grandsons were too weak, too law-abiding, too civilized to respond with appropriate force. The Hayes family had tried law. Sheriff Morrison had been sympathetic but useless, constrained by rules of evidence that favored criminals over victims. They'd tried negotiation. Tommy Garrett's smirk in the Piggly Wiggly parking lot had made clear how he valued their appeals for justice. They'd tried economic pressure, asking friends and neighbors to boycott Garrett family businesses, but fear of retaliation had kept most people neutral. Violence was the last option, but sometimes the last option was the only option that worked. Samuel Hayes had learned that lesson on Pacific Islands where Japanese soldiers had to be dug out of caves one by one, where negotiation meant death and mercy meant defeat. The Garrett family had chosen to fight this war when they stole Blue. The Hayes family would choose how it ended. At 11:15, Tommy Garrett's pickup truck appeared on the road leading back to his cabin. He'd cut his trip to Sparta short, perhaps feeling uneasy about leaving his property unguarded, perhaps just bored with whatever entertainment the roadhouse offered. Samuel watched through binoculars as Tommy parked beside his cabin, got out, and walked toward the kennel where Blue had been kept. Tommy stopped when he saw the cut lock lying in the dirt, the open kennel door swinging in the morning breeze. He looked around carefully, hand moving toward the pistol Samuel knew he carried, suddenly aware that his safe little world had been invaded by forces he hadn't anticipated. "Blue," Tommy called, his voice carrying across the hollow. "Here, boy, come on back." But Blue was 3 miles away, safe in Samuel's truck, beginning to remember what it felt like to be with someone who loved him properly. Tommy called again, louder this time, with an edge of panic that suggested he understood the implications of a missing dog and a cut lock. Samuel emerged from the tree line 50 yards from the cabin, rifle held casually but ready, like a hunter who'd spotted his quarry and was moving into position for a clean shot. Tommy saw him immediately, recognized him despite the distance, understood with terrible clarity who had taken his stolen property and why. "Mr. Hayes," Tommy called, forcing his voice to sound friendly and reasonable. "I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding here. Maybe we should talk this over like civilized folks." Samuel kept walking, closing the distance between them with measured steps. At 30 yards, he stopped and raised his rifle to his shoulder, sighting down the barrel at Tommy Garrett's chest. "No misunderstanding," Samuel said, his voice carrying clearly across the morning air. "You stole my dog. Now you're going to pay for it." Tommy's hand moved toward his pistol, then stopped as he realized the futility of drawing a handgun against a rifle held by a man who'd been shooting for 60 years. "Look, Mr. Hayes, I bought that dog fair and square. Got papers to prove it. Maybe there's some confusion about ownership, but we can work this out without anybody getting hurt." Samuel's finger moved to the trigger. "You can lie to the sheriff, Tommy. You can lie to your family and your friends and yourself. But don't lie to me. I raised Blue from a pup. I know every scar on his body, every quirk in his behavior. You stole him from my yard, and you've been keeping him locked up like some common animal instead of the champion he is." The distance between them was perfect for a rifle shot, close enough to guarantee accuracy, far enough to provide time to react if Tommy tried something desperate. Samuel had chosen his position carefully, the way he'd been taught by Marine instructors who understood that preparation prevented poor performance. "Even if that's true," Tommy said, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool morning air, "stealing a dog ain't worth killing someone over. You're talking about murder, Mr. Hayes. That's a whole different level of trouble than what we're dealing with here." Samuel's rifle remained steady, aimed at center mass, ready to fire on a moment's notice. "You made it worth killing over when you decided the Hayes family was weak enough to steal from, when you made my dog into a symbol of how the Garretts can take whatever they want from whoever can't stop them. This isn't about Blue anymore, Tommy. This is about respect." The morning sun had burned away most of the fog, revealing the hollow in sharp detail. Birds sang in the trees, cattle lowed in distant pastures, and life continued its normal rhythm around two men facing each other across 30 yards of autumn grass, one holding a rifle, one calculating his chances of survival. Tommy Garrett made his choice. His hand flashed toward his pistol, a desperate gamble that he could draw and fire before Samuel could pull his trigger. It was the kind of mistake men make when panic overrides judgment, when the primitive brain decides that action, any action, is better than standing still and dying. Samuel Hayes had been expecting this moment since he'd emerged from the tree line. His finger tightened on the trigger with the smooth precision of long practice, and the Springfield spoke with the authority of a weapon that had ended lives on 3 continents across 4 decades. The shot echoed across the hollow, bouncing off ridges and rolling through valleys like thunder announcing the storm to come. Tommy Garrett fell backward into the dirt beside his cabin, his unfired pistol spinning away into the grass. He tried to speak, to plead, to negotiate, but the bullet had torn through his chest and collapsed his lung, leaving him with only the strength to gasp and stare at the blue Tennessee sky he'd never see again. Samuel walked over to where Tommy lay dying, rifle ready for a second shot if necessary, but Tommy's eyes were already glazing over, his body twitching with the involuntary spasms that mark the transition from life to death. In less than a minute, it was over. The first payment on the debt the Garrett family owed had been collected. Samuel keyed his radio with steady hands. "Eagle to Bird Dog. Target 1 is down, proceeding to Target 2. The response came immediately from Marcus, positioned near Bobby Garrett's double-wide trailer. "Bird Dog copies. Target 2 is in position, ready to proceed on your order." The Hayes family had crossed the line from law-abiding citizens to killers, from victims to avengers, from people who trusted the system to people who made their own justice when the system failed. There was no going back now, no possibility of explaining or negotiating or finding a peaceful resolution. 7 men were going to die before the sun set, and the Hayes family was going to be responsible for every death. Samuel looked down at Tommy Garrett's body, feeling nothing but a cold satisfaction that the first debt had been paid. He'd expected guilt, horror, some human response to taking a life. Instead, he felt only the calm certainty of a man who'd done what needed doing and was prepared to do it 6 more times before the day ended. The war between the Hayes and Garrett families had begun with theft and mockery. It would end with blood and justice, Tennessee style, the kind of justice that flowed from rifle barrels when courtrooms failed and good men decided they'd had enough of being victims. The paper mill where Bobby Garrett worked the evening shift sat 12 miles from his double-wide trailer, connected by winding county roads that snaked through hollows and over ridges where a man could disappear without a trace. Bobby had called in sick that Friday morning, claiming stomach trouble, unaware that his decision to stay home would seal his fate. Sometimes the choices that seem insignificant at the time turn out to be the most important ones a person ever makes. Marcus Hayes positioned himself in the tree line behind Bobby's property at 11:45, watching through binoculars as his target moved around inside the trailer. Bobby was 34 years old, built thick through the chest and shoulders from years of manual labor, with the kind of casual arrogance that came from never facing real consequences for his actions. He'd been the brains behind the dog theft, the one who'd spotted Blue's quality and convinced Tommy that stealing from an old man carried no serious risk. The trailer sat in a cleared area surrounded by junk cars, broken appliances, and the accumulated debris of people who took more from the world than they gave back. A satellite dish perched precariously on the roof, and extension cords snaked across the yard to power various pieces of equipment that probably hadn't been purchased through legitimate channels. This was the kind of place where stolen property got stored until it could be sold, where questions weren't asked and receipts weren't provided. Marcus had grown up hearing his grandfather's stories about honor and responsibility, about the difference between taking what you'd earned and taking what you could get away with. Looking at Bobby Garrett's setup, he understood why Samuel felt compelled to act. This wasn't just about Blue. This was about two different philosophies of life colliding, about whether decent people would allow themselves to be preyed upon by those who'd abandoned all moral constraints. At 12:15, Bobby emerged from the trailer carrying a beer and walked to a lawn chair positioned near an old burn barrel. He seemed relaxed, unaware that his cousin Tommy was already dead, unaware that the Hayes family had declared war on everyone who'd participated in Blue's theft. Bobby settled into the chair, popped open his beer, and lit a cigarette, enjoying the kind of peaceful Friday afternoon that comes from not having to work an honest job. Marcus keyed his radio softly. Bird dog to eagle. Target 2 is in the open, approximately 40 yards from cover. No other individuals visible on the property. Ready to proceed on your signal. Samuel's voice came back immediately, calm and professional. Eagle copies. You are authorized to engage Target 2. Make it clean. Marcus had been hunting these mountains since he was 8 years old, had learned marksmanship from his grandfather and his father, understood the difference between a good shot and a perfect one. The distance was manageable, the target stationary, the wind minimal. He settled into a prone position behind a fallen oak log, steadied his rifle against the bark, and controlled his breathing the way Samuel had taught him. Through the scope, Bobby Garrett's face filled Marcus's vision. The man was smiling slightly, perhaps thinking about something amusing, completely unaware that death was looking at him through magnified optics from 60 yards away. Marcus felt a moment of uncertainty, a flicker of doubt about what he was doing. Bobby had a wife, children sleeping inside that trailer, a life that would be shattered by what was about to happen. But then Marcus remembered Blue's condition when they'd rescued him, remembered the smirk on Tommy's face in that parking lot, remembered his grandfather's quiet dignity as he'd explained how the system had failed them completely. Some men forfeited their right to mercy when they chose to prey on those they considered weak. Bobby Garrett had made his choice when he decided the Hayes family was fair game. Marcus's finger found the trigger, applied steady pressure, felt the rifle buck against his shoulder as the shot broke clean and true. Bobby Garrett's beer exploded in his hand, the aluminum can spinning away in a spray of foam and blood. Bobby himself toppled backward out of the chair, his cigarette arcing through the air like a tiny comet, before landing in the dry grass near the burn barrel. The trailer door burst open, and Bobby's wife appeared, still in her bathrobe, trying to understand what had happened to the peaceful afternoon. She saw her husband lying motionless beside the overturned chair, saw the blood spreading across his white t-shirt, and began screaming with the particular anguish of someone whose world had just collapsed without warning. Marcus remained in position, watching through his scope as she ran to Bobby's body, as she knelt beside him and tried to shake him awake, as she realized that no amount of shaking would bring him back. He felt nothing for her grief. She'd married a thief, had benefited from his criminal activities, had raised children in a household that operated on the principle that might made right. Her tears were payment for choices made long before today. Samuel's voice crackled through the radio. "Bird dog, report status of Target 2. Marcus keyed his microphone. Target 2 is down. Clean kill, no complications. Wife is present but poses no threat. Withdrawing to Rally Point Alpha as planned." Marcus gathered his equipment and melted back into the tree line. moving through the forest with the careful steps of someone who understood that leaving evidence was the difference between justice and prison. Behind him, Bobby Garrett's wife continued screaming, her voice carrying across the hollow like a siren announcing that the old order was dying and something darker was taking its place. By 1:30 that Friday afternoon, 2 of the 7 targets were eliminated, and the Hayes family was ahead of schedule. Eddie Garrett and his uncle Wayne were still working their moonshine operation deep in the woods, unaware that their criminal enterprise was about to be permanently liquidated. Daniel Hayes had been tracking their movements since dawn, following them through terrain so rough that most people wouldn't attempt it on foot. The still was hidden in a hollow 3 miles from the nearest road, accessible only by trails that wound through dense forest and across creek beds that turned treacherous when it rained. Wayne Garrett had chosen the location carefully, far enough from civilization to avoid accidental discovery, close enough to his home base for practical operation. For 15 years, he'd been running corn liquor through these mountains, selling to customers who valued quality and discretion above legal niceties. Daniel positioned himself on a ridge overlooking the operation, studying the setup through binoculars while planning his approach. The still itself was a professional installation, copper tubing and stainless steel tanks that represented significant investment and expertise. Wayne took pride in his work, produced liquor that was smooth and clean, and commanded premium prices from buyers who knew the difference between good moonshine and the harsh rotgut that amateurs made in their bathtubs. Eddie Garrett was the muscle of the operation, responsible for moving supplies in and product out, for dealing with anyone who got too curious about Wayne's business. At 31, he was the most dangerous of the Garrett men, had done time for assault, carried scars from knife fights and bar brawls that had taught him the value of striking first and striking hard. If anyone in the family was likely to put up serious resistance, it would be Eddie. But Eddie's reputation for violence worked against him now. He'd grown complacent, accustomed to being the most dangerous man in any situation, unprepared for facing someone who approached violence as a military operation rather than a barroom contest. Daniel had learned patience from his grandfather, precision from years of operating heavy machinery where mistakes meant death or dismemberment. At 2 o'clock, Wayne and Eddie took a break from their work, sitting on logs beside their still and sharing a jar of their latest batch. They were laughing about something, probably a story about customers or law enforcement, or some misfortune that had befallen their competitors. The moonshine business bred a certain cynical humor, a way of finding amusement in the constant chess game between criminals and the authorities who chased them. Daniel settled his rifle against a tree trunk, found his targets in the scope, calculated wind and distance with the automatic precision of someone who'd been shooting all his life. 2 men, 40 yards apart, both armed but relaxed, both unaware that death was studying them through magnified optics. The tactical situation was more complex than the previous engagements, requiring careful timing to prevent either target from escaping or returning fire. Wayne was the primary target, the leader of this particular criminal enterprise, the man who'd taught his nephew Tommy the finer points of theft and intimidation. Eddie was secondary, but equally guilty, the enforcer who made Wayne's operations possible through fear and violence. Both men had profited from Blue's theft, had laughed about the Hayes family's inability to recover their stolen property. Daniel's first shot took Wayne in the chest, the bullet striking just below the sternum and driving him backward off his log into the creek that ran beside the still. Wayne's jar of moonshine shattered against a rock, the clear liquid mixing with creek water and blood in a combination that seemed somehow appropriate for a man who'd made his living from illegal spirits. Eddie reacted faster than Daniel had expected, rolling behind the still and drawing a pistol in one fluid motion. But Eddie was thinking like a street fighter, focused on finding cover and returning fire, not understanding that he was facing a sniper who could engage him from positions Eddie couldn't even see. Daniel's second shot found Eddie as he tried to move from the still to a larger tree, catching him in the shoulder and spinning him around before a third shot finished the job. The hollow fell silent except for the sound of running water and the distant call of a crow somewhere up the ridge. Wayne floated face down in the creek, his blood creating a red slick that would wash downstream and eventually reach the Tennessee River, carrying the evidence of his life's end toward the Gulf of Mexico. Eddie lay crumpled beside the still that had been his livelihood, his unfired pistol lying in the dirt beside his outstretched hand. Daniel remained in position for 10 minutes, watching for movement, listening for sounds that might indicate other people in the area. The moonshine operation had been thoroughly eliminated, its operators dead, its equipment intact but useless without the knowledge and connections that had made it profitable. Within a few years, the forest would reclaim this hollow, and all traces of Wayne Garrett's criminal enterprise would disappear beneath layers of fallen leaves and new growth. "Eagle, this is Hammer," Daniel said into his radio, using the call sign Luke had assigned him. "Targets 3 and 4 are down. No complications, no witnesses, no evidence left behind. The still is intact but inoperative. Proceeding to extraction point Bravo." Samuel's response carried a note of satisfaction that Daniel had never heard in his grandfather's voice before. "Hammer, well done. We're more than halfway finished. Target 5 should be arriving at his location within the hour. Luke is in position and ready to proceed." Chet Garrett was the wild card in the family, the nephew who worked construction jobs in Nashville and came back to Riverbend County when he needed money or a place to hide from whatever trouble he'd stirred up in the city. At 26, he was the youngest of the Garrett men, but also the most unpredictable, with a drug habit that made him dangerous in ways that were hard to calculate or plan for. Luke Hayes had been watching the road leading to Chet's usual hideout, an old barn that had been converted into rough living quarters on the edge of the Garrett family property. The barn sat beside a creek that wound through the valley, surrounded by pastures that hadn't seen cattle in years, but still provided good fields of fire for someone positioned on the surrounding ridges. The Hayes family got their dog back, but the price was 7 lives and their own souls. By sunset on September 12, 1986, Samuel Hayes and his grandsons had crossed a line no decent people should cross, transforming from victims into killers in the span of 18 hours. Blue lived another 3 years before dying peacefully on Samuel's front porch, but the recipe for mountain justice they'd used to retrieve him died with the men who'd stolen him, buried under blood that no amount of time could wash clean.